Hello, everybody, and welcome to this latest in the ValuesJam guest session series. Robyn, brilliant to have you here from the other side of the world. So to start with, please introduce yourself and tell people about the great work that you do.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me to this. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm Robyn Simpson. I'm the founder of a company called Choose the Tood, which is a social enterprise. And that's all about attitudes and taking personal responsibility for your choices. And I'm also the creator of the Kind Communities Project. And that is a world first platform and series of programs that are designed to inspire people to take daily acts of kindness and make that a habit. And it's all about, it doesn't matter what age you are, everyone, it doesn't matter how much you've got or how little you've got, kindness is available to everyone. We want to make that, we want to share and celebrate that and make it contagious.
Fantastic. And it's interesting. Over the weekend, actually, there was quite a lot going on LinkedIn about kindness. And what you've just touched on there is this thing around it's limitless, right? And it's really only down to our choice whether we choose to be kind or not. I
Exactly.
don't know that there's anything else like it, is there?
No, not really. There are a few concepts and things that sort of butt up against it, and I guess they all support each other, like empathy and connection.
Yeah.
They're all aspects of kindness. But kindness in itself, yeah, love is the biggest form of it, I guess. But yeah, I find that it's an international language. It's everyone understands it. It's just one of those human things, and not only humans, it's other animals as well. But for humans, kindness sets off those neurotransmitters in our brains, and it's it does become contagious because our energy is contagious as well. So I think kindness is the antidote to a lot of social dis-ease.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Well, I'm not sure that we will be able to draw the card kindness from the deck.
That's okay. I can talk about other things.
Yeah.
We'll
So
see.
here's the deck of cards, and so what I'd like you to do is choose a number of piles that I'll make in front of me.
5.
5 piles, okay. They're not going to be the same size; they'll be random sizes. So there we are. So now this hand is the left side for me, and this hand is the right side. So left number 1, then 2 to 5. So which pile would you like number?
3.
Right. So the middle one, that's the biggest pile. 2.
More choices.
I've got 16 cards. So which number between 1 and 16?
I'm going to go 8.
8. Well, we didn't go kindness, but we weren't so far off, Robyn.
Oh,
Generosity.
oh, fantastic. Great.
So the
Now
first,
that's interesting.
why?
Just before you start there, because I have literally just finished listening to a podcast about generosity.
Well,
Hmm.
okay. Well,
Which I will share with you afterwards.
yeah, well, we'll benefit from that then. So the first question to get us on our way is this: what does generosity mean, and what does it look, feel, and sound like?
Oh, what does generosity mean? Well, it is a form of kindness, to go back to that. Generosity means giving something to someone else who is in need. Sharing. I don't know the technical dictionary definition, but to me, it's giving of something to someone else to help them.
Yeah, and for me, there's something about the magnitude of that deed, in that when you regard somebody as generous, it's kind of they're giving more than they needed to or might have
Mm.
expected to. There's something about relativity in there. Do you think?
Yes, a little bit more than you would than the general norm, I guess. You're giving more of yourself.
Yeah. So for instance, I don't know if you know, but my original career was in commercial hospitality management. I don't know why this has just popped into my head now, but imagine a restaurant situation and somebody's just had their meal and then they've left a gratuity. You know, it says on the thing 10% is normal. And so the diner leaves 20%. So that just came into my head as an example of, oh, well, then you would say, yeah, that guy was being generous because
Yes.
it's more than the expectation might have been. What about the metaphor? So if you tap into that creative part of your brain, when you think about generosity, what does that look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like?
Oh, okay. What came into my mind instantly was uh, bigger than self, supporting, lifting up. There's a bunch of things coming up here, but it's all around um, helping others, paying it forward. Selfless is another word that's popping into my head.
Mhm.
Connection is a big thing here. In order to be generous, you need to have connected with someone. You actually, and now my brain is going backwards through connecting the dots. In order to connect, you must have felt some empathy to
Right.
make that connection, to take the action to be generous. So there's a bit of a process there.
Yeah. And it's what about the level of intention? Because think of what's another example? Imagine some charity collectors in the street, right?
Mhm.
And imagine somebody who's reasonably wealthy walking down the street, and they've got some notes in their pocket, and so they put it into the bucket or whatever it is. Um,
Mm.
how generous is that when perhaps the
Mm.
intention isn't really there? It's kind of, this money doesn't mean very much to me because I've got loads of it. I'm just passing this person with a bucket, so I'm going to put some in there. Is that generous or not?
Oh, that's interesting. It's generous. I think the question is to what degree or what depth is that generosity?
Okay.
And what was popping into my head when you were talking about that was, um, is it the amount that you're giving, or is it how much that means to you? So that relativity. So in terms of, if it was like I love to tell the story of a lady who was extremely generous to me when I was not very well, and she just popped around and brought a massive box of food. And she'd pre-prepared the meal. She'd thought about it. There was a lot of generosity in that act. But what made it feel even more generous is that I knew that her situation, she was not financial. She was doing it tough. So to me, that level of generosity just went sky high because of her situation. So, because I knew how much it took for her to be able to do that. So, yes, I think there is a level of intention, a level of personal view, yes, is one way to look at that. Like for her, that box of food would have meant a lot more than it would have to a millionaire, for
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the value to the person giving it as well as to the person receiving it,
Yeah.
it
Okay.
makes a difference.
Okay. And this is making me wonder about the difference now between generosity and kindness. So it's a fine line, right?
It is. And I think, I mean, maybe there's a crossover here. Or generosity is an act of kindness. Is there
Right.
ever a time when generosity is not an act of kindness? Are they mutually exclusive?
I think it's a great question. It comes back to that relativity thing because to be kind, I think there is a relationship with either the level of self-interest or perceived self-interest, perhaps. And if the level of self-interest is higher, then the perception is that that person's being less kind. It could be the same act, but if it's actually for their benefit, either more or even, then people think, oh, well, you're not really being kind. You're just doing this because you've got an ulterior motive. So, how does that relate to generosity? Yeah, I think it just processing it, it seems similar in that one person would say, oh, that was really generous. And the other person might say, well, not really, because, and then explains the motivation for the act. So, but that doesn't answer your question about are they mutually exclusive, does it?
Okay, well, let's look at it the other way around, because a couple of things came up as you were talking. One is that on the podcast, and I will find the name of it, sorry, I don't have it right here. On the podcast about generosity, they were talking about this particular point, and one of the professors at the end actually said, look, does it really matter what the intention, or, is any act of kindness, I think somebody asked them from the audience, is it any act of kindness actually a true, or generosity actually a true act of generosity, or is it always to make the giver feel good about themselves or lift themselves? And he said, does it really matter? And I kind of agree. Do we need to pick people and pull them back for being generous?
Yeah.
Is that not just stopping the generosity?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And there are a couple of things here. One is a bit dark, and the other is really strongly in support of what you've just said. So which would you prefer first?
Either, we'll go either way.
Right, well, let's continue the theme then. So I agree with you in the whole, I think, because kindness begets kindness, or generosity begets generosity, right? So if somebody is generous and that encourages other people to be generous as a result, in a way, I'm kind of, well, if there is a bit of self-interest in there, it doesn't matter so much, because as you get further away from that initial act of generosity, the people that are encouraged to be generous, who might not have been generous previously, don't know anything about the motivation of that initial act. And so what? The dark bit, though, is when somebody's being generous or kind for the wrong reasons. So, you can imagine a pedophilia, for instance. It's easy for everybody to understand. But that, again, hopefully those acts are absolutely the minority. And I've always believed that you should kind of treat everybody in one way rather than trying to mitigate risk of the minority of situations that might happen. And then the risk is that you treat everybody in that way. So what do you think about those two things then? One, the big piece, agreeing with what your podcast was talking about, and then that little bit of beware.
Oh, look, I think there's always an opportunity for somebody to use things in a harmful way. So, and we see it in lots and lots of different areas, right? I'm going to use an unusual example, but politicians, when they're campaigning, some of them are campaigning very, very well, and they're campaigning for really good things. And then others are just not, shall we say. I'm sure. So they may be, quite often here in Australia, I've seen the campaigns and wondered what the heck that particular politician is actually standing for, because all they're doing is pulling apart the other politicians. I'm kind of like, well, you have a platform here, you could be using it for good, but you've chosen not to. So, I think there are lots of different areas in life where we could taint all politicians with that brush, or we could go, well, actually, the general good of humanity, humans, I believe anyway, more of us are naturally good-hearted and kind and tended and those sorts of things than we are on the dark side. We've all got a dark side, I'm sure, but most of us have a stronger positive side than a negative side.
Yeah.
But I do think this is actually coming to, interesting how our world has changed and the type of media we consume and how much of that, depending on where you put your focus, of course, and we choose where we put our focus. I've chosen not to watch the news for the last, I don't know how many years, because it's too negative for me. I don't want to feed that into my brain. Some people might say, oh, well, you're Pollyanna. It's like, and I'm quite happy with that. I'm happy to build those positive pathways in my brain. But I do, I'm not immune to any negative news. There's news around us hitting us from all sorts of different angles, and social media is an absolute classic. But I feel like it depends on where we put our focus and what we choose to believe is true. So again, it's a choice, and whether or not you feel like generosity is you can choose to see it as a positive contribution to society or not, but that's your choice.
Yeah. I know you touched on politics here. Maybe we shouldn't get too much into this, but it
Sorry
sounds.
about
No, no,
that.
I'm just thinking it sounds like we might have similar views on this because, oh, I don't know. It's just that politicians are such, or supposed to be, such as strong role models in society. And
Mm.
I don't know whether there's been any research on this, but intuitively, it feels that leaders in too many countries don't actually understand the degree to which their behavior and what they say has an impact on society, because it's disproportionately important.
Mm.
And
It is, because they have the platform,
yeah, yeah,
and we are, in my opinion, we are condoning their behavior by allowing them to behave in that way
exactly.
without, yeah. So
Yeah,
it's yeah, I don't know. I mean, going back to the whole generosity thing in terms of is it, if there is an intention that is that is more about being self-important and lifting oneself up rather than the actual deed or the person that they're giving the generosity to, is that a bad thing? I think it comes back to the intention of the person and how strong that is.
yeah. So
And again, you touched on a particularly black point, a dark side. And yes, obviously there is that extreme, and there's always an extreme. There's usually a bell curve, right?
yeah,
So
but
yes, there's always going to be that underbelly.
in politics, though, I've got an example in my head now of what we're going to do is cut taxes, if you elect us. Now, that's very generous, right? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I get the point. Yeah, well, it depends on whether or not they do it.
As well. Yeah, because the other side of it, isn't it? And I'd never really understood how that works, is that if you were in a job and, when you applied, you said, I will do these things, then if you don't do those things, you kind of get fired, right? Or else you have to justify why that hasn't happened. Whereas in politics, it seems to be a completely different story where you've got your manifesto and then you can just change everything as you go to suit your own needs. And it's like, where's the accountability?
Mm. Yeah, and I think we touched on before, there's the two ways of looking. I'm just going to circle right back to that mutual exclusivity.
Yeah.
Like, okay, so is kindness mutually exclusive from generosity? I don't believe so, because to me it feels like most acts of kindness are most acts of generosity are intended to be kind.
Right.
Are If we look at it the other way around, is kindness mutually exclusive? No, hang on a minute, I got that wrong. Is generosity mutually exclusive from kindness? Are there times when generosity is not kind? And I think yes, there are. So an example might be that different parenting styles might appear very, very generous, but the longer term impact of those parenting styles, I mean, let's say it's one that's a detached parent that is not interested in managing how much screen time or gaming time or whatever the device time, whatever it is, or they're not teaching good life skills, so they're a very detached parenting style. That's not generous or kind. There may be, I don't know, I'm trying to think of another example that might highlight that point a little bit better. But I feel like there are times where you can be generous to a fault.
Yeah,
And there's another point.
you're making me wonder
Sorry.
here about whether this is kind of touching on a different, we've talked about how close the two are, but I think listening to you, I'm starting to wonder about a difference. It seems to me that kindness is more focused on the intention and the empathy bit, whereas generosity is more focused on use of resources. So
Yep.
it's kind
Yep.
of, I've got this stuff, and so I can use it in this way, and I'm generous. Whereas the kindness is much more about being thoughtful of the other person, and it seems like a deeper intention rather than generosity, which is, like I say, use of resources. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a good distinction, actually. I'm just trying to think of an example where, let me see. Oh, nothing's popping into my mind, but I do like what you said about use of resources. And again, it sort of what popped into my head was what we were talking about earlier around, how valuable is that resource. And I have seen a bit of research around the people with less are more generous. And I think we've just gone full circle, because the research showed that it was because they understand how valuable that is to the other person.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Whereas if it's a billionaire,
Yeah.
then giving $50 is nothing. But to someone who's really doing it hard, giving $50 is everything.
Yeah.
So resources like that how affluent is the resource is an aspect to think about.
Okay, well let's take this lead in terms of being a bit more kind of nitty-gritty about the conversation. There's a question here which will help us get into that, which is, where have you noticed a lack of generosity?
A lack of generosity. I'm sure it's in lots of places. A lack of generosity. My brain's going to kindness all the time. uh, I think, gotta be honest, there's nothing is popping into my head straight away, but I'm sure it will. It'll come to me because there are many, many examples of it.
I wonder whether it's you mentioned that your mind's going to kindness, and I'm finding the same
mm,
actually. So lack of
mm,
generosity strikes me. I'm not going to talk specifically for a minute. I'm just thinking more generally. So this is when somebody's like, "Oh, that was a bit mean," or you could have done a bit more. And actually, I'm thinking of myself with charity giving. So if somebody comes to the door collecting for a charity, um, I think they won't consider me to be very generous, because what I say to them is that I respect your charity, but I've decided what I'm going to do to support various charities, and yours isn't on it, and that's what I do. So sorry, but that's it.
Mm.
So I can imagine those people going away saying, "Whoa, that guy's not very generous." Um, so there maybe there's an example actually that their perception would be that I'm not. Um,
Well, their perception of that particular instance,
mhm.
not necessarily their perception of you as a whole person, because you are generous because you give to other charities. It's just not their charity. So it's
Mm,
of that instance.
yeah,
Um, yeah, I want to say the banks aren't particularly generous sometimes. So some of the corporates aren't particularly generous sometimes. And it depends, even if we're not talking financial. I want to go to, some workplaces are not generous when it comes to looking after their employees. They ask a lot of people, and they want the blood, but they don't necessarily reward in the same way or to the same degree. So, you look at the number of cases of burnout. People are talking about burnout and anxiety and what have you, and the social trends are going in the wrong direction. Absolutely. So, there's a case of we're not being generous if we're allowing people to get to burnout.
yeah, totally agree. And there's
And
some,
maybe the employee themselves is being too generous to allow themselves to get to burnout. There's two sides to that equation.
yeah, and I think it's a very complex relationship between employer and employee, and one that is changing dramatically from what it used to be. And
Mm.
I sense that that's why we're seeing such issues arising, because it kind of used to be when I was growing up, it was accepted that you were like a slave. You basically, I have sold my soul because of the paycheck, and what's expected of me might not be reasonable, but it's fair because I get paid that much.
Yeah,
And
and
that's a,
I'm happy. I'm grateful to have a job.
yes, and that's a really unhealthy relationship, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and now it seems that people are less willing, younger people are less willing to accept that status quo. And because we're in a super connected world now and the truth gets out sometimes really very quickly, there's no longer that kind of stranglehold that the employer has over the employee. Um, and I'm not sure that a lot of leaders have worked out how to deal with that actually, because
Mm-hmm.
they've grown up under a different way. And generosity is, like we said it right at the beginning, it's giving more than you need to. So in a business
Mm.
situation, if you're a leader, why would you do that? You know, it's I've got these resources that I'm managing, and I've got to create value by using those resources. So why would anybody expect me to give more than I need to whatever part of the business it might be? So generosity seems to be very human, whereas the traditional approach to running businesses is not particularly.
No, it's very transactional instead
Yeah.
of emotional.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So is that
yeah, I agree.
is that another difference then? Generosity is, it's not transactional, it's more emotional, or is it just that it's
Uh,
transaction plus emotion?
Well, you could go back to what we were saying earlier, and there are acts of generosity that aren't really emotionally charged. They're just,
Yeah,
oh, well, I'll
yeah,
just, I think there's a spectrum again.
yeah. And actually, you remember your question about does it matter? So I'm
Hmm.
involved with a project where we applied to an organization for funding, and they've got loads of money, and they probably don't have a fantastic intention. It's probably quite a transactional assessment process they go through, and then they decide to award the money. Um, but I don't really care because they we needed that. We're going to be able to put it to really good use. And so I don't really need them to be generous. Um,
Yeah.
so
You don't need them to be emotional about it or empathetic about
yeah,
it. You
yeah,
just need them to disperse the money.
yeah. Mm. And do you know what
Do you think were they I don't know what kind of grant it was that you were going for, but was it something that they were looking for uh, positive use of the money?
Oh yeah, it's all really positive. They're all about supporting disadvantaged children. This project is very much focused on that. And so
Right.
all of the policy intention is in the right place. Um, but it still feels like when you get into like business processes and transactions, there doesn't feel like there's a lot of room for something like the emotion of generosity because you're making very objective decisions, I suppose.
But isn't the foundation of that one based on something quite generous?
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So it's interesting. I mean, the whole world of philanthropy is based on generosity, and yet that's where we go through those business processes to access that generosity. So yeah, I can see the two sides of that, but I feel like in those instances, because they're wanting to support positive initiatives, they're coming from a generous heart in the first
yeah,
place.
totally agree with that. And you've reminded
Mm.
me, I'll send this to you afterwards. There's a YouTube video by Dan Pallotta, and he talks about how we've got charity all wrong. And what he describes is that charity was invented by the Calvinists when they went to America. So, um, religious community, but also absolutely focused on making shed loads of money. And what he describes
Mhm.
is how they felt bad about themselves making all this money. So they created charity to say, okay, well, that'll make us feel better about ourselves if we're giving 5% of what we're creating to charitable causes. So what he's
Mm.
kind of saying is that the whole concept is flawed because you shouldn't be doing it for that reason. You should be doing it because you want to help other people, not because you want to feel better about it yourself. And this, you mentioned that right at the beginning of the conversation, right? About is it is it about making yourself feel better, and then does it really matter at the end of the day? Mm.
Mm.
And what about so we've kind of gone down into that detail there. So let's lift ourselves right up
Yeah.
again and
Mhm.
ask this question: how could more generosity improve the world?
Oh. Oh, look, for me, my brain goes straight into a circular impact initiative. So, and I guess like the more resources out there for people to use to do positive things, the faster that flywheel goes, the better impact we make, the more resources we have, the more, and so it goes around, or that's what I'd like to see. Um, ooh, and I'd like to say the more resources, well, it comes back to intention. What are they being used for? um, because where my brain went there is, for me in my world, I'm wanting to interrupt some um, some downward spiraling trends, if you like, social trends that are going in the wrong direction. What I want to do is intercept those, and it requires generosity and kindness to be able to do that and flip them over to be spiraling in the other way.
Yeah.
So, but then, you know, you could, I don't know, it's one of those ones where I can see it could go either way.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point you've raised there, really interesting point, is this. I think it's touching on effective allocation or use or impact or whatever it is, because there's no point being generous if it's ineffective, right? If you're wasting all of the money that might be generously given, then it should have been given, or it could have been used in a better way. But so to answer that question about how could more generosity improve the world, for me, it's about fairness and equity, because we have all of the resources in the world that we all need. So why is it that some people can squirrel away, billions of dollars, while other people are starving to death? That doesn't seem to be a very good way to run the show.
And I wonder, things like education are popping into my head. Are people educated about these things? Are there gaps in the education system in different parts of the world? Because if we were educated in how to manage money better from a young age, then the world would probably be in a better, more equitable place. But when I was growing up, that was never in our curriculum. And even today with my kids, they're in primary school at the moment, and there's nothing to do with financial management or anything like that. And ironically, there's not a lot to do with generosity. There is caring. They talk about caring in the education system,
Okay.
but not so much about being generous, which is interesting. It's just sort of, that's just popped into my head, and it's like, oh, I don't think they ever say anything about generosity. They do talk about kindness, but not generosity per se. So are we teaching the generations behind us generosity? And if so, how are we doing that? And are there gaps in that?
And you're making me wonder about, now this is a little bit off topic now, I guess, but the education system used to be there to kind of transfer knowledge, kind of, right? But I think it didn't used to get involved so much in the kind of softer space and character building and all of that sort of thing, because that was looked after in the family unit, or maybe in the religious community or the local community. But what's happening with society over time is that all of those three, family, religion, and local communities, are kind of diluted over a period of time for whatever reason. And so it feels like probably there is not such a good job being done in terms of character building for young people as they're growing up in that context. So then the question is, does education have a responsibility, or is it unfair to expect them to fill that gap?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I agree. Our villages are the feeling of a village and the culture of a village here in Australia seems to be quite a distant memory. The days of, oh, here we go. When I was growing up, in a tiny little town in New Zealand, I remember going into the butcher's shop with my mother, or the fruit, the grocer's shop, and this particular gentleman would always give the children a piece of fruit, or the butcher would give us one of the little red saveloy things, and that's generosity. But
Yeah.
it was also how villages worked. And we did literally live in a village. It didn't have many people in it, but that was how my generation grew up. And I just don't see that happening as much anymore. I don't know. Maybe I'm not, I don't know. I haven't seen that in a long time.
Yeah, and I think you used the word earlier, connection, and I'm wondering if this is the reason when it's something to do with generosity being sparked or encouraged or enabled by a sense of connection. And if I think back to that example that I used about the restaurant, it I've been in that situation myself where because there's a connection with the food server, you do give a bit
Mhm.
more. But
Yeah.
if it's just a kind of technical assessment of how well they've done their job and it's very objective, then I think you're less inclined um because
I think
generosity.
you've touched on something
Go on.
that interpersonal thing. And
Yeah,
so I know you're talking about connection, but I want to add a little extra distinction of interpersonal connection, person to person,
yeah,
because I think it is that, two humans connecting on a level that makes the difference here, which makes it different from that business transaction that we were talking about earlier.
yes. So it's generosity driven by a subjective sense of human connection rather than an objective assessment of value or something like that.
Yeah,
Mm.
I feel like we're getting closer.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Now, so I'm gonna two questions for us to deal with before we wrap up. The first one,
Mhm.
you can invent. So ask your own question about generosity, beginning with who, what, where, when, why, or how.
Ooh, okay. So, what is the most generous act or experience you've ever had?
Whoa. Okay, so the one that comes into my mind, and I'm not sure whether this is I don't know why it's come into my mind. So when I was 16, my friend had a scooter and
Hmm.
he could ride it, and I hadn't ridden a scooter before. And he invited me to have a go. So near where I lived, there was a small hill which came down to a road, and then you had to turn either left or turn right onto this at the junction. So I came down the hill on the scooter. I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd seen people on bikes lean to be able to go around a corner. And so I did that.
Uh-oh.
I did that without knowing that scooters don't do that, and ended up scraping the handlebar of the scooter down the side of a neighbour's car that was parked opposite the junction. Um, so I went and told my mum, and she said, "Well, what are you going to do?" And I said, "I don't know." And she said, "Well, I know what you need to do. You need to go and tell the guy that this has happened." So I'm like, but he's going to be really angry. And she said, well, I don't know whether he is or not, but you need to go and tell him. So I went, knocked on the door, he answered the door. I explained what had happened. I could see that he was very unhappy. And he said, thank you for letting me know. And didn't ask us to pay for it. He sorted it out. And so I don't know why, but that came into my mind as a very generous thing for him to have done. What
Yeah.
about yours? What about yours?
Oh, well, I've already mentioned the one about the food. Let me see. Oh, there have been a lot. I'm not going to say it's the biggest, but something that happens a lot in this little cul-de-sac that we live in. We've got the most amazing neighbours. On either side of us are retired couples. So we're the noisy ones on the street with two kids. But there is a lot. Oh, here we go. This is when we first moved in to the house, and I remember the house was like my children were 18 months old and 3.5 years old at the time. My husband was away working, and so we had, imagine an empty house. We hadn't moved any furniture in. And I was in here trying to paint and run after children and change nappies and feed kids and all that kind of stuff. And there was a knock on the door, and one of our neighbours came over. We hadn't met her before, and she came over with a kettle full of water and some cups and everything to make a cup of tea. She said, I knew that you would not have found your kettle yet. So she brought everything over so we could have a cup of tea. And then the other neighbour popped over and she had baked some cake for her. And that was really generous. Like just the thought that went into that, I thought was very generous. But we often, like, I'll plant a certain lot of vegetables in our garden, and the neighbour over the side, she'll plant different ones.
Yeah.
And we'll swap.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do a lot of that, and same with the neighbour on the other side. So we do a lot of I don't know, generous gardening. We share a lot of fruit and vegetables between us.
Yeah, and so again, we're coming back to this human connection, aren't we? Because rather than you thinking of yourself, you're thinking of yourself as part of something bigger, a community. So rather than you say, oh, well, I need to grow this different variety of vegetables just for me, you're saying, well, if I grow the onions and the garlic and they grow the potatoes and the carrots, and then we swap, we're all going to do well out of this. So it's that ability to kind of look beyond yourself, I think, that comes into play with generosity. Now, to wrap up this values jam, there's always the final question is always the same, and it is, what are you encouraged to do differently about generosity as a result of our conversation?
Oh, well, the very first thing that pops into my head is have a conversation with my family about it. So,
Okay.
Especially the children, and ask them what they think generosity is, and get them thinking about what we've been talking about. And then beyond that, not just have the conversation with my family, but I will also have that conversation in the Kind Communities project as well, because I think it's quite a fascinating one to dig into. So I appreciate the questions.
Okay. And when are you going to have the chance to have that conversation with the family?
Well, I hope you can't hear all the noise in the background.
No.
Getting dinner ready.
Okay, so
So
that's going to be a
probably
dinner.
after we finish this conversation.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, very soon.
All right. So mine is you remember we talked about the charity thing,
Yeah.
that example that I gave. So I'm not sure that my approach to charity is something that I've paid attention to too much. And so I'm going to list the ways in which I do support charities at the moment. And then I'm going to compare that to my values, and I'm going to consider whether it's a good enough match or not. And if it's not, then I'm going to explore what changes I can make there. So that's been, gosh, that's been really helpful.
And when are you going to do that?
Good question. So right after this call, I'm going to look at my calendar for the next 2 weeks, and I'm going to put an initial hour in there. It won't be this week because at the end of the week I'm going to visit Bordeaux in France with my son, and then I've got a client project next week. So it's likely to be the end of next week, something like that. But the key is to put it on my calendar, because if it goes on the calendar, it gets done.
I suspect you're going to be thinking about it anyway now. So I'd have some note-taking device of some sort, whether it's the traditional pad pen or the phone, whatever, and just start as it pops in your head, get it down.
Good suggestion. Good suggestion. Well, Robyn, that's been a values jam. So you now know what it's like to be a values jammer.
I
Enjoy
love
the
it.
conversation with the family, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed it. Thanks, Ellen.
Cheers.